Well, this is going to be a data-driven talk today. The data that I'm going to work with is the stream of ethical issues that cross my desk. Ethical issues in scholarly publication comes under the general topic of the responsible conduct of research, or RCR. But if you Google responsible authorship, you will also get a lot of hits and hoots. Now, there's no absolute standard of morality on this issue. There is not an 11th commandment that says, "Thou shalt make proper attribution." Rather, responsible authorship is a community standard. It is what your colleagues say it is, and that changes and shifts over time. It varies between physical science and social science. It varies between qualitative and quantitative research. There are little differences in every discipline, and I'm not sure I could ever accurately cover those differences, but I can address some fundamental issues that will cover probably 90% of what you encounter regardless of your discipline. Now, there is a huge body of literature on this topic, and I've handed out a sheet that gives references that I'm going to use. And the primary material out there has been driven by biomedical research. You heard a talk this morning about publishing in biomedical research. Now, biomedical research is about the cure of disease and the reduction of morbidity, which is dying. And so when somebody fakes data in biomedical research or misanalyzes it, the societal costs can be absolutely huge. And that's why the National Institutes of Health has sponsored a large number of projects focusing on the responsible conduct of research and has put that material out there to be freely available. And I'm going to use some of that today. Primarily, I'm going to use the first reference that I've put on the handout. It's Avoiding Plagiarism, Self-Plagiarism, and Other Questionable Writing Practices, a Guide to Ethical Writing by Miguel Roig. It's a pretty thick document, 60-some pages if you were to print it out. But it's available online. It's a good handbook, and I'm going to use it as a textbook today to talk about. There's no point in my trying to rephrase and make up this stuff. Roig has done an excellent job of hitting the major topics. He essentially lays out 27 guidelines for authors. And I'm going to go through about half of those in detail and mention the second half of them. There isn't really much disciplinary variation in what he writes, and so it's going to be equally useful to you in the humanities or the sciences. It's also pretty current. I think he last revised it a couple of years ago. So you don't need to take a lot of notes. You can go back and read this afterwards. And to start on that, probably the topic that is first on any list of improprietous authorship issues is plagiarism. So let me give a definition of plagiarism, and I'll use the definition from the American Association of University Professors. Plagiarism is taking over the ideas, methods, or written words of another without acknowledgement and with the intention that they be taken as the work of the deceiver. Now, that's pretty broad. Not just words, but ideas and methods. Unless you've been sound asleep for several years, you couldn't help but notice the news articles about college presidents and members of Congress and other notable figures who have gotten into hot water by appropriating articles and speeches of other people. A lot of them have lost their jobs. Whenever I read about a university president giving a speech that he or she didn't write and getting drummed out of office, I'm just amazed. And yet, it happens. It happens a lot. Plagiarism is not confined to whole sentences or paragraphs. It can involve the source of your ideas. And an ethical writer always acknowledges the contributions of others and the sources of his or her ideas. Now, verbatim text needs to be put in quotation marks, of course, but paraphrasing or summarizing someone else's thoughts is just as much their idea as taking their text wholesale. It doesn't matter if you've summarized 4 paragraphs down to 4 sentences. It's the idea behind it that is not yours. Simply changing the words, the order of the words, using different words, it's still plagiarism. If it's someone else's thought, then it's not your thought. And no matter how you do it, if you leave the reader with the thought that that could have been your idea, then it's plagiarism. You must identify the source. Now, there's another aspect to that, though. If you are paraphrasing or conveying the work of somebody else, you have an ethical responsibility to convey that work accurately. You can't shade it. You can't change the meaning by changing the order of the words. You have to understand it, and then you have to convey it accurately, lest you give somebody the idea that your source meant something different. Your source meant what he or she intended to mean, and you have to make sure that you respect and accurately convey that. Now, this handbook, this Roig's article, has a lot of examples of paraphrasing and summarizing, and I commend that to you. But now let's say you're doing your literature search and you read something that's just common knowledge. It's the idea, the statement is just intuitively obvious. You assume that it's intuitively obvious to everybody, but you like the way the person said it. It's got a ring to it. And you say, what a great way of expressing that. And you put it in your head and move on, and then later you use it in your paper. Is that plagiarism? Well, of course. The creative expression of ideas is an art form. An artist should get their due. You didn't think of it. That's why you noticed it the way you did. It had a ring to it. And you say, gee, I can't remember everything I've ever seen. An idea pops in your head. You're watching Mario Batali on the Food Network, and he says something like, wretched excess is just barely enough. And you say, oh, I love that. And then 2 years later, you say it, and you've plagiarized Mario Batali. So what do? How do you catalog all these things that go into your head while you're doing your research? Well, scientists have a way of doing that, and it's called a lab notebook. Scientists write down everything they encounter. They keep track of their data, they keep track of the conditions that it was taken under, they keep track of the time of the day. They wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and write a note down and date it the next morning. And they do that because they've got to defend themselves when somebody challenges their patent application or the originality of their ideas. And in science, there's a lot of challenge to that. But you folks in the humanities and social sciences can do the same thing. You can keep a notebook. You can write down the ideas. If you think, oh, I love the way that sounds, I like the ring of that, I want to make a note of it, write it down, but write down an attribution. Write down where you found it. And then when you use it, give somebody the credit. This is a matter of professional development and a matter of professional maturity. So the bottom line on plagiarism, that if you're in doubt as to whether a fact or a concept is common knowledge, provide a citation. I think Roig does a good job of that in citing some things he says that you would just assume, well, that's just common knowledge, but he provides citations for things that are in the words of other people. So now let's get to the really tough question. Can you plagiarize yourself? Let's say that you published 2 different articles on very different topics, but they both relied on the same background material, so you just take the background material from the one article and set it down in the next. You probably think it would be ostentatious to cite yourself, so you don't, and you come up for tenure. And somebody on your review committee takes some of your text from the second article and types it into a search engine. And bingo, up pops your first article. this author didn't cite that first article. So now the reviewer is suspicious and takes a bunch of your other text and types it into a search engine and finds that you've been rather sloppy, rather lazy. You've reused a lot of material, and so now your tenure package has been compromised, and you're on the defensive, and in defending yourself, you hire a consultant. Maybe he or she is a lawyer, and you bring the lawyer into your review committee, and the lawyer says, and this is life and death, you know, whether you're going to get tenure. And the lawyer tells the committee there's no such thing in law as self-plagiarism. Plagiarism is the appropriation of the ideas or words of another. So how can you plagiarize yourself? Well, what's the right answer? Well, remember I said there's no absolute standard of right and wrong. There's no 11th commandment. This is not a matter of law. This isn't a legal issue, it's an ethical issue. And ethical issues are seldom black and white. They're just varying shades of gray. And, but you've got an ethical issue here. So now I'm going to leave Roeg and give you my own opinion on this. I think responsible authorship mandates a certain amount of hard work. I further believe that laziness should be eschewed. When you write an article, it should be a new article. Stephen King doesn't take sections of his novels from one novel and drop it into another, having read most of them. Why should you reuse portions of your articles? If you want to nitpick over legal issues, then I'll be happy to tell you that you're violating copyright, because a citation includes the publisher, not just the author. But we shouldn't have to go there. For my own standards, and I admit I'm old, I'm conservative, probably cantankerous, but I think the propriety demands that if you want to recycle your own previously published work, you should make it clear in the article that you're doing so. And let the reader assess the degree of your laziness. And if that embarrasses you, don't do it. Well, self-plagiarism leads into a couple of other issues that I encounter all the time. One is duplicate publication, and the other is fractionation of data. Duplicate publication is what it says. Submission of the paper in basically the same form, more or less the same data sets and with fairly related outcomes, and submitting that to 2 different journals. You'd be absolutely amazed at how many articles get published a second time in a peer-reviewed journal without mentioning the first. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, or rather, you don't have to be a biotech scientist. We rocket scientists don't get much attention anymore for brilliant insight. But you don't have to be a biotech scientist to know that it's really easy to get caught. All you have to do is type in a few words from an article into any search engine, and you will get every use of that on the planet in the last 2 decades. I guess I'm always just stunned at how stupid smart people can be. But it happens all the time. Miguel Roig cites the 2001 study by Shine, which found that 92 of 660 cases, 660 studies taken from 3 major surgical journals were actual cases of redundant publication. 92 out of 660. That's 14%. That's just astounding. Now, it's fairly easy to detect duplicate publication. It's harder to detect fractionation of data, since the papers usually address different sets of outcomes. But fractionation constitutes egregious behavior as well. And there's an excellent example in this document that I'm using, Roig's publication. that illustrates the very practical problems for science in fractionation of data. So let me read something for you. It's in a 1995 editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this is in Roeg's publication. But Jerome Chancellor and Marcia Angel write, "Our guidelines regarding redundant publication are published each week for the information of authors. In a practice followed by many journals, we ask authors to send us copies of any manuscripts closely related to the manuscript they want us to consider for publication. This allows us to decide whether there is excessive overlap between two manuscripts or whether the results of a single study are inappropriately divided into two or more papers. In the trade, the latter practice is sometimes referred to as salami slicing. The reasons for preventing redundant publication are not arbitrary. As earlier editorials have pointed out, multiple reports of the same observations can overemphasize the importance of findings, can overburden busy reviewers, fill the medical literature with inconsequential material, and distort the academic reward system." And then they go on to describe a couple of examples. Authors sent a manuscript describing a controlled intervention in a birthing center. The author sent the results on the mothers to us and the results on the infants to another journal. The two outcomes would have been more appropriately reported together. Who would have thought that we as academicians, as faculty members, the mentors of the next generation of scholars, would so odiously violate the principles of academic honesty that we espouse in the classroom. The pressure to publish can be intense. And in both of these cases, duplicate publication and dividing data sets up, the results into several different papers in order to enhance an academic record, that violates the principles of academic integrity. So does this mean that you can't reuse data sets? Well, first I think you have to ask the question, why did you collect the data? And why are you reusing it? Now the line here is rather gray. If you've got a data set and you analyze that data and you get the results out of it, the birthing center data where there's data on the mothers and data on the children, taken together, the data are inextricably intertwined, it's a single study, it's done in a single period of time, then I think it's fairly odd. Most people would agree that that doesn't warrant breaking up into two papers in order to bolster your publication list. On the other hand, there are long-term studies where data is continued to be collected over long periods of time. There are studies where new analysis techniques come up and you want to go reanalyze the data. And there are other circumstances that over time you might want to revisit important data sets. But smaller projects that run their course or are compact generally should receive attention in a single publication. If you're uncertain as to whether to write another article with your same data or involving the same outcomes, just ask your colleagues. Better yet, ask a journal. Ask the editor of a journal. If you're afraid to pose your question on that topic to the editor of a journal, then you probably know the outcome. And I would recommend that you not do it. There are other issues on secondary use of research data. One of the references I've given you is by Margaret Law on the secondary use of research data to study a problem that was not the focus of the original data collection. In Professor Law points out several issues there. I invite you to look at that if you're into data sets. Not all of you would be, but there's a lot of issues. Probably not, the use of data sets second time is not an egregious an infraction as plagiarism or duplicate publication, but as far as ethical scholarship goes and ethical authorship, you need to understand the circumstances. I think bottom line here is the process of submitting, refereeing, and publishing a journal article is time consuming and it's expensive, and you don't want to waste the time of hardworking people, and you don't want to waste the resources of journals. You've heard today what a hard time journals have staying alive. You don't want to make that more of a problem. In the end, I think you have to ask if the publication will stand on its own 2 feet. Is it an important topic? Is it contributing to a body of knowledge consistent with the other works, the other publications in your portfolio? And if not, maybe it should just be a letter to an editor. Maybe it should be a poster at your next conference. But you really need to consider if what you're writing is being done to add to the body of knowledge that you want to be known for, or it's being done simply to bolster your publication portfolio. Now, I said that Miguel Roig presented 27 guidelines in his handbook. What I've said is a summary of the first 13 of those 27, and the last 14 he calls lesser crimes and other questionable practices. And I'm not going to talk about all those, but there are a few I want to discuss. I will never cease to be amazed at the sloppiness of smart people. We as academicians can be real nitpickers when it comes to the transgressions of students. We lower a grade over fine points of grammar. We take issue with faulty reasoning. We demand attention to detail. And then we throw our citations together at the end of one of our publications with abandon, not checking the references well, sometimes not even reading the articles that we're referencing, and not checking that each source in the reference section has the correct citation or the volume and page numbers of the journal are correct. Now, I present this to you as food for thought. But a more serious issue with citations is the occasional attempt to manipulate citation indices. Do all of you know what citation indices are? The journals use them to determine the importance of the journal. How many times are articles in a particular journal cited by others? If one journal gets cited 5 times more than another journal, then the first journal is probably more important and people will want to publish in it more. And authors do the same thing. If a particular article gets cited more than other articles, it means that that article must have been really important. And I can assure you that faculty will mention that in their tenure application. It's a measure of your impact on the field. So, can you change the impact of various people, including yourself, by adding references to your publication? Some journals will ask you just to cite articles in their journal. Don't do it. Don't succumb to that. This is about academic integrity. This is about honesty. This is about saying what citations really need to be made based on the work that I've presented. Resist the temptation to reference yourself simply to bolster your own index and your own impact factor. Those pressures are out there. You need to be aware of them. So now I've told you to reference everything, and now I'm telling you don't reference everything. Do less. Is that confusing? Well, reference what you need to reference. You can figure that out. If you do need it, get the original article. Read it. Remember I said you have an ethical obligation to accurately convey the meaning of what you're citing. Read the article. Check the citation, and if it's germane, or if you've quoted it, or something like that, or used material from it, or used the ideas, do reference it. But don't reference things just to bolster the reputations of yourself or others or the journal. Don't rely on secondary resources. If you're referencing something, you have an obligation to have looked directly at that. An historian certainly understands this principle, but some of us in the physical sciences can get sloppy on that point. You know, if your paper is dependent on those ideas, you know what you need to include, and so be accurate, be complete in your citations, and then be frugal. There are other guidelines in Roig's book. I'll let you peruse those. I think I've probably hit on the major points I wanted to, and but I'd be happy to answer questions on anything regarding ethical publication. Yes?
That's what the guidelines are for presenting at academic conferences if you're presenting a paper that you're publishing. Is there any order you should do it, or can you present the same paper?
Well, generally at a conference, you don't have the time to go into the detail and present the data set that you're going to present in a journal publication. You're going to talk about your outcomes, and you're going to talk, but unless you're presenting a plenary address or an invited talk, you're going to have 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes to present your paper, and that doesn't really substitute for putting it down in detail in a journal publication. Giving your talk after you publish the journal article is probably not feasible because now everybody can read it. There's no point in giving the talk. But I think certainly in the sciences, and I suspect in the humanities as well, there are many conference proceedings or many conference presentations that are followed up by a journal article.
Actually, I just have a comment in terms of historians. A lot of times, for humanities and social sciences, but in history, for example, someone will publish a journal article in the Journal of Southern History or American History, and then they will adapt that article into a chapter for their next book. And that's something publishers disagree upon, but it's always in your best interest to ask the publisher if that's okay. Some of us feel that as long as it's appropriately cited, and you need to get permission from the journal itself, that it's okay, and that a journal article can be in prior advertising, whetting people's appetite for the journal, for the book to come. But you want to make sure you're very clear with your publisher and your journal publisher before you proceed on that. But that's one little example.
But that's an excellent point, because what you're talking about is a situation where everybody knows what's going on. The journal is given permission to put it in the book. The book publisher has said, yes, that's appropriate, and you've cited it. And then you remember, plagiarism, self-plagiarism, fractionation, duplicate publication, these are all attempts at deception.
Right.
And this is out in front. And again, I mentioned disciplinary variation. If that's customary in history, then it's what the community says it is. But the important thing is that it's out there for everybody to see. Everybody understands that it was earlier published in a journal. The journal agrees, the book agrees, then you're good.
But
you're clean.
Is don't assume, and that's what I'm saying as well.
Yeah.
Even though that's understood, I always encourage authors to go, keep your nose clean, do whatever it takes.
Absolutely.
So no one can think you're deceiving.
And that's a good example.
I have a question about not so much the actual publishing, but if you're working with an advisor and you're publishing a paper together, Are there rules in terms of talking about something before it's published, in terms of sharing? Do you need permission to convey like results or ideas that have not been published when you're working with someone?
Well, you're talking about discussing the research with someone else before actually writing the paper?
Yes, and working with someone else. And
working with an advisor.
Yep.
Several relevant points about that. First, if advisors frequently, thesis advisors frequently give ideas about how to analyze and approach data. And you say, you're looking at this and you don't see something in the data, and your advisor says, well, have you thought about looking at it this way? And maybe you can't describe this phenomenon, but maybe if you use this principle, you could describe it. And you do that and it works. At that point, I think in a publication, your advisor perhaps deserves co-authorship. But this raises another interesting question. Under what conditions does an advisor deserve co-authorship? And I think the answer to this is universal. It applies to colleagues, it applies to advisor-student relationships, and that is that every author listed on the paper should have made a contribution, a significant contribution to the work presented in the paper. Being the advisor in name does not convey, in my opinion, entitlement to authorship. I think there must have been a contribution. Now, I can tell you that we periodically have a dispute. A student finishes his or her PhD, starts writing up the data under his or her own name, single authorship. The advisor says, I deserve to have my name on this paper, and a conflict ensues. And the ultimate test here is who made what contributions. Well, this gets into really a tough area, because quite frequently those contributions aren't documented very well. You're having coffee with your advisor, and the advisor suggests that you try a different analysis method, or look at the data in a different way, or maybe collect an additional bit of data to see if such and such a thing is happening. Or have you gone and looked at the work done by such and such a person? You might get some more insight into this. And so contributions come in a huge variety of ways. This is where the ethical responsibility is put upon you to assess whether the advisor or a colleague, it can be in a collegial relationship, doesn't have to be a student-teacher relationship, whether the other person made some contributions. We get back to the first principle here of plagiarism, using the ideas of another. If those ideas came to you by another person, it doesn't matter whether they were written down, mentioned to you over a cup of coffee, or any other way, then you need to give that person recognition. You give that person recognition one of two ways. You cite them, personal communication from such and such a person, or you make them a co-author. And it's a matter of degree. There are many, many papers that get where a citation is the name of a colleague, personal communication. I've done it in my papers a lot. Others have cited me in the same way. You give a little piece of information, it's not worthy maybe of co-authorship, but it's a citation. On the other hand, if a colleague has given you ideas that led you in a different direction and has discussed it a lot with you and came up with serious contribution to your end results, then you should consider co-authorship. And again, no black and white here, but it certainly comes under the heading of responsible authorship.
I wonder whether there are campus resources here available to graduate students or junior faculty who have questions in the course of doing their research.
It's a hard question for me to answer. Generally, students seek the advice and get the best advice from their mentors. So, and I would hope that all of our faculty and all of our student mentors have a good grasp on the ethics of scholarship. On the other hand, I see enough problems to know that that's not 100% true. When you look at the way the world works, graduate students are graduate students one year and they're faculty members the next. And this business of responsible authorship is it's one piece of developing a professional standard and a professional reputation and a professional career. And it just because, when you get that sheepskin, it doesn't suddenly convey wisdom on you. It simply recognizes that your first important piece of work, perhaps. I'm available. I hesitate to say I'm available to all 5,000 of our graduate students, but I'm certainly available to any faculty member that wants to come and discuss an ethical issue of publication, and that's probably a good thing, because when there's an ethical lapse somewhere, I'm going to see it sooner or later, particularly if it's raised in a tenure case, and that's where it gets raised most often, because tenure review committees are more and more typing people's articles into search engines. Any other comments? Yeah.
Just a comment. What Steve just said is exactly right. Talk to somebody before you do it, because if it reaches his office and we have to go through the process of trying to sort it all out after the fact, it consumes incredible amounts of faculty time and your time. So it's best to get those things sorted out up front. My goal here is for everybody to be wildly successful in a scholarly career. And so you don't ever have to be embarrassed to ask a question about research ethics. As I said, research ethics is a community standard. It's not a matter of knowing the law. Talk to colleagues, talk to journal editors, talk to publishers, talk to me. This need not be a point of embarrassment that you don't know the answer to something. It will be an embarrassment if you just assume you know the answer and you get it wrong. And so please, if you've got a little uneasiness with something, talk it over with others. You'll never be marked down for doing that.
I have two questions. One about the fractionation of data. With individuals that are working with large national data sets, NGAINs or others, and variables using that, would you consider that fractionation of data?
It depends on what you're doing in the particular study. If you're doing a study on a data set and within the confines of that study, within a year or two period, you get results out of it, and the question comes up, are these results worthy of two articles, or would they fit better together? Do the results on the one set of results support the other results? Would a reader feel more comfortable seeing all the data at once? Would it, let's assume that you make two articles out of it, and one reader reads only one of them and doesn't ever find the second article for some odd reason. Would it compromise the body of knowledge that he or she is trying to absorb? Would it be appropriately absorbed all at once? Or is it unrelated in some way where it doesn't make a difference? Those are gray areas, not black and white, but a journal could give you, a journal editor would look at that and very quickly probably decide whether the journal would like to see it as one or two articles. Again, that's a case where I think it makes a lot of sense to ask the journal what they'd like to see. Now, working with large national data sets, you're going to go back to those data sets many times.
Some people make their whole career
Absolutely, and that's perfectly legitimate. But quite frequently the data or the outcomes are somewhat unrelated, or they, in the case of a longitudinal study, they take snapshots of things at different periods of time and warrant separate articles. But again, I think it's always useful to consult with the journal editor, and my experience is journal editors are quite happy to get that question.
The second question, thank you. The second question I have is, has this been an issue here with self-plagiarism and fractioning and duplication here at this university? I'm new here, so I'm asking for informational purposes.
Yes, it has.
It has?
It has.
In what way?
Well, simply that this usually comes up in promotion and tenure review, where a committee looks at a body of scholarly work and digs into it and finds that there is duplicate publication or fractionation or self-plagiarism, because indeed, as I said, reviewers are typing it into search engines these days, and it's pretty easy to find. And the self-plagiarism is not so clear-cut. It's the other plagiarism, appropriating the ideas of others without citations, is extremely egregious. And I think probably everyone would agree that you simply don't do that, and no reasonable person would ever think of doing that, and yet it does happen. The fractionation of data is probably probably an issue that a lot of young faculty don't understand. That's not good academic practice, and it's and I think it's probably it probably happens by our failure to mentor those new faculty members the level we should be doing. That mentoring needs to be occurring at the department level. Departments need to discuss these publication issues with new faculty and be sure there's a standard for that field that's observed. We probably ought to do more of these kinds of sessions to educate people. Faculty members don't have a license on knowledge in this area. This is not what you did your research for a doctoral dissertation on publication ethics. This is just something that you're expected to know. It may be an unreasonable expectation in the absence of any mentoring, but new faculty members are no different than new graduate students. This is there's a learning curve, there's a period of professional development, mentoring is needed, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us as members of the Academy to see that mentoring takes place at every level.
I guess I would add to that when you're referring to mentoring, because you did say that there's some shades of gray in some of this between these various definitions you provided.
And among different disciplines.
Exactly. So depending on the mentor may have their own shades of gray on some of this too. So in terms of their approach to mentoring and the information they're sharing in terms of shades of gray. So it may behoove that in new faculty orientation, if this is something this university or this group has had some issues with or is important, that it's sort of discussed in new faculty orientation to give heads up to.
Maybe that would be a good brown bag, Steve.
Would. We probably ought to do more brown bags like that. Now as I think I said at one point here, I'm conservative, and so but I think there's probably some wiggle room here on some of the issues of self-plagiarism, but I think the general advice I would give anybody, which I think is the most universal advice, is if there's any question whatever, discuss it with colleagues, several colleagues. or a journal editor, and see what the feeling of the community is. Remember, these are community standards. My observation is that the tenure review committees tend to be conservative like I am.